You are listening to the Break Time Tech Talks podcast, a bite-sized tech podcast for busy developers, where we'll briefly cover technical topics, news snippets, and more in short time blocks. I'm your host, Jennifer Reif, an avid developer and problem solver with special interest in data, learning, and all things technology. This week, I prepped for several events where I'm presenting next week. From updating some repositories to prepping presentations, it's not really glamorous, but it does produce better results. Then I worked on streamlining processes to template my work and cut down on a bit of the boilerplate. Finally, I've had a blog post and a tab that I finally caught up on, and it's a good one for understanding how to generate better knowledge graphs. Let's dig in. First of all, next week, I have a couple of upcoming events that I am prepping for this week. The first one is an O'Reilly Learning Platform online training for GraphRag fundamentals. There's still slots available, so if you are part of the O'Reilly Learning Platform, whether through a subscription or through work or something, there also is a few days, maybe 7 day, 30 days, something like that, free trial that you can join and spin up as well if you're just interested in seeing what this is all about. I will save the link in the show notes if you're interested in that, but I am updating several things to go along with this online training. It's a 3-hour workshop type of format and very conceptual based, and then some hands-on and demos and showing code. The second event next week is an AI Agents Conference. This is a virtual event. I have a session scheduled for later in the week for that. It goes most of the week, I think, for the live event, and I'm really excited to give this session. It's a little bit of a condensed version to some themes and topics I'm working on this year, and I'm really excited to give this and be a part of this event that I haven't actually participated in before. So in order to prep for all of that, I'm working on updating some repositories. I boosted the Spring Boot and Quarkus versions for the O'Reilly training that I'm doing. Ended up needing to tweak a few syntax things to accompany those version updates. So I have 2 repositories out there for the online workshop. I have a Spring Boot version and then I have a Quarkus version. So in order to make sure everything's all up to date and working properly, I upgraded both repositories to the latest versions. And then of course had to make some minor changes to syntax and other things to make it work. The biggest change was that I realized the database that I was using to access and present GraphRag had a little bit of some older data, which maybe didn't used to be that big of a deal. But of course, now in this day and age, we can get up to date, instant, recent events. I wanted to make sure we had all the data and recent data that we could get. So I asked some colleagues, asked around in Slack if there was an updated version. There is, so I switched to that. But the embedding model that was used for this updated version was different because, of course, embedding models have changed so much. I had to update some configuration. And because I updated the configuration, then the prompts and the tool definitions needed updated a bit for getting just better results and better tool calls. So I did updates to the framework, which led to updates to the data, which led to updates in the config and the prompt. And so this is something that I am noticing with AI application updates is that you can't be too married to your prompts because new model updates tend to shift everything. Now, one bit of advice I have come across a couple of different times is not to choose the latest model. Just like you wouldn't choose the latest Docker tag on a Docker image or a container, you would pick a specific version and tie it to that so that you wouldn't have a bunch of changes happening constantly. And even when there's updates, you change a minor version of that when you're ready to do that. Sticking with latest means that whenever they make a change, that change gets propagated and cascades down to anything that is using that specific tag of the container. In this case, same thing with the model. You can actually select a particular version of a model, kind of like a version tag, if you will, and that will tie it to that. And of course, you only make the changes when you're ready to update or upgrade. It wouldn't then update out from under you overnight or something like that. And this is the same advice that I've seen, again, for things like Docker containers and library versions and lots of other things. This is another good reason, though, to prep early for your commitments because you never know what will end up popping up and then taking additional time. Some additional things that you just didn't plan for, didn't foresee, those things crop up, and it just reduces the stress if you plan a little bit more in advance. At least start looking at things well in advance of actually presenting or getting up in front of people. All right. The next thing I had a little bit of time to take a look at this week was the Neo4j Educator Program. So I've mentioned before that I've been doing some updates and such. I talked to some colleagues this week, and our Neo4j Graph Academy, where we have our online free training courses for Neo4j, has been making a lot of updates and working on a lot of strategy for adapting how technical folks are now learning, because it has shifted. Now, learning doesn't feel terribly different to me. I kind of have a process and a go-to approach that I use for learning. It, of course, has altered and adapted over time, but I still tend to default to similar practices and first steps out of the gate when I want to learn something new. However, the new students to the tech industry seem to be learning in a totally different way. And this is not something that I'm super familiar with, but it is something I'm interested to know more about. So we're reaching out to some folks at the Neo4j Educator Program. If you're interested in pinging me or providing feedback, if you're involved in the Neo4j Educator Program, if you've been teaching graphs in Neo4j, I'd be more than happy to get your thoughts and just better understand what educators are dealing with right now with graphs and technology, and maybe the things that students are adapting to well and maybe struggling with too. Okay, so that was another little side quest, if you will, for this week. Then, as I'm digging into some of these things, I realized there's a lot of things that I don't really get a whole lot of chance to go back and do. There's, for instance, tech blogging I've always loved, but it's not something that I've had a bunch of time to be able to dedicate to lately. I have a lot of other projects going on. So are there ways that maybe I could streamline my work and amplify what I'm already doing, making some of the processes that I just defaulted to over time a little bit more efficient and adjusting those as I go? I have been saying how I've been missing tech blogs, but I tried to go back and write one, and I realized how manual the process actually is. I create the file, I find a featured image, I outline my sections, I assemble the resources, and often I spend quite a bit of time just setting up the outline of things before I actually dig in and write. So I went back this week and I created a template file for my blog posts. Now, nothing creates the content for me. I'm still doing all of the writing here, but I am setting up the outline, the header, and the other information that the boilerplate can then get dropped in with a command. This is good old-fashioned scripting, right? It doesn't completely remove my work, but kind of like a keyboard shortcut, it does trim the edges down just a little bit. I really enjoyed working on this and playing around. And as another bonus, I did get a blog post out. So that is now published on my website if you're interested in checking that out. It's along the process of some of the content and themes that I've been working on this year around agents, tools, and MCP. I did a high-level blog post to start us off, and then I hope to dig into different pieces and components of this project I've been working on this year. I am still in the process of building the full pipeline out, but I will keep you posted if I make any other automation improvements in processes or just daily practices that I'm working on. This was a lot of fun to play around with. All right, the piece of content that I want to talk about today. This has been sitting open in my browser tab for I think a couple or a few weeks now, maybe. I hate to admit that, but I finally got a chance to sit down and walk through it. I'm really glad I took the time to do so, and I didn't get sidetracked with other content or things, because this was a really great blog post. It reinforces a pattern that I have noticed when constructing knowledge graphs. In that, defining a narrowed down schema helps a large language model generate better results. The article goes through and talks about having a large language model or even a natural language process, NLP, define nodes and relationship structure with no boundary. If you don't set up any boundaries for the large language model or the NLP to create the graph structure, then it produces very refined results, and lots of them. It picks very specific, individual, nuanced relationships and nodes, and tons of them. You end up getting a messy, overly complicated graph. What ends up looking like a ball of spaghetti if you try to visualize that. In music, this is kind of like the theme and variations composition type. For those of you who might be musically inclined, in a theme and variations composition, you have a main or a simple theme, very introductory, singable often, and then each variation that comes after that, it proceeds to progress into very complex and obscure renditions off that theme. Sometimes by the time you get to the end of the piece, the original theme is barely recognizable. There's lots of other notes around it. There's runs and slides and all sorts of interesting things that kind of hide that original theme. So in a graph, you end up with this if you let an NLP or LLM generate everything with no boundaries. This very obscure, almost obfuscated look to what should be a very uniform and maybe easily understandable graph. For instance, the article goes through relationship types, things like produced by, results in, can all be slightly different interpretations of the same representation. A large language model will generate those 3 separate relationships entirely differently and as individual and custom relationships. Depending on how things are structured in the text that it's extracting from, you'll get very refined verbs, basically, that get turned into relationships. Then the process becomes entity resolution, defining out some sort of rule set for how to consolidate these variations on the same theme. In the Neo4j GraphRag package, you can set entity, relation, and pattern types for the generation process to follow. Now, that doesn't completely take out all of the issues, and there are some other things that can crop up with that, but it is nice being able to set the entities, the nodes, and the relationships, and then some patterns for how you want those nodes and relationships to interact with one another. That narrows down the scope a little bit, so then your process, whether that's NLP or LLM, can generate a more consolidated and easier to understand graph. This helps narrow down those options and reduce the spaghetti effect of knowledge graph creation. I really liked this article and all the things that it walked through, and the fact that it approached knowledge graph construction from the original machine learning process, things like NLP and entity resolution, while also including LLM generation approaches too. It encompassed a little bit of everything. I liked its approach and the things that it explained really well and in detail for why narrowing that focus down a little bit can help produce better results. What didn't originally appear to be an exciting week turned into opportunities to tweak a few processes that I've done by default. I also prepped for some events next week, which didn't seem glamorous, but prepping early always pays off. Finally, I read a good article that backed up how and why defining some sort of schema produces better results for constructing knowledge graphs. Whether with an NLP or ER or LLMs. Whew, that's lots of acronyms. Talk to you next week. Thanks for listening and happy coding.